We were left a £22 billion black hole for this year in the public finances. Those are numbers, and that was spending covered up by the previous Conservative government, who during the election campaign made more unfunded commitments. We cannot carry on like this. And so it's not a decision I wanted to make, but it was a decision that I had to make in incredibly challenging circumstances to put our public finances on a firm footing. I would never take risks in the way that Conservatives did with our economic stability and our financial stability, because when you take risks with a country's financial stability, you go the same way that the previous Conservative government did, putting huge pressure on family finances with interest rates and mortgage rates spiking and putting pensions in peril. I won't take those risks. That required difficult decisions.
Good day, Britain. You know you've achieved something truly spectacular in the annals of terrible governance when you've managed to out-tax Gordon Brown, out-burden Rishi Sunak, and claim the dubious distinction of being the most tax-raising Chancellor in at least 6 decades, all within a mere 18 months of occupying number 11. Racheal Reeves has accomplished precisely that feat, announcing a staggering £75.1 billion in annual tax rises according to an historic database of budget measures maintained by the Office of Budget Responsibility, putting her comfortably ahead of Gordon Brown's £62.1 billion and Rishi Sunak's £54.9 billion. Reeves is responsible for 2 of the 10 biggest tax-raising budgets on record, her November raid bringing in nearly £30 billion annually, whilst her debut budget last year ranks as the second-largest tax grab in modern British history. This is a story of how Labour's Chancellor has picked the pockets of hardworking Britons more aggressively than any predecessor in living memory, why she refuses to rule out coming back for even more despite pushing the tax burden to historic highs, and how her legacy after just 18 months is already cemented as a Chancellor who taxed Britain into submission whilst claiming she had no other choice because of that mythical £22 billion black hole that's been debunked more times than we can count. Quick favour before we explore this record-breaking taxation spree. If you're furious about being taxed more than any generation in 6 decades by a Chancellor who promised Labour wouldn't raise taxes, hit that subscribe button right now. Over 94% of you watching haven't subscribed yet. It's completely free, takes a second, and helps us keep exposing politicians who raid your wallet whilst claiming they had no alternative. Smash that notification bell so you never miss when we document the next tax grab or broken promise. If you just subscribed, you're brilliant. Cheers. Now, let's dissect how Reeves became the tax champion nobody wanted. Let's start with the sheer scale of what Reeves has accomplished, because the numbers are genuinely staggering. £75.1 billion a year in additional tax burden on hardworking Britons. That's not a typo. That's not cumulative over decades. That's annual additional burden from measures announced in just 18 months. To put that in context, Gordon Brown, who spent a decade as Chancellor and was notorious for stealth taxes and endless fiscal tinkering, managed £62.1 billion. Rishi Sunak, who had to cope with COVID economic collapse and Ukraine war fallout, announced $54.9 billion in tax rises. Norman Lamont, during the 1990s crisis, managed $41.7 billion. George Osborne, through years of austerity, managed $41.6 billion. And Racheal Reeves, in 18 months, has beaten all of them combined. That's not just impressive in a terrible way. That's historic in the worst possible sense. The OBR maintains its database of all tax policies scored at fiscal events since 1970, adjusted for GDP growth to present day, giving us the best indication available of the size of packages announced by chancellors over time. The figures don't account for measures raising more or less than anticipated, and they miss some smaller changes before the OBR's creation in 2010, but they provide an apples-to-apple comparison across decades of chancellors. And by that measure, Reeves is in a league of her own, and not in a good way. The database shows Reeves is responsible for 2 of the 10 biggest tax-raising budgets on record. Her November 2026 package ranks 7th largest, bringing in an eye-watering £29.8 billion annual by 2030 to 2031. That's only marginally less than Conservative Geoffrey Howe's spring 1981 plans estimated at $30.3 billion in today's terms, and Labour's Dennis Healey's spring 1974 budget that brought in $30.8 billion. Her debut budget last year was initially assessed as the biggest tax raiser ever, though it's now being classed as marginally smaller than Norman Lamont's spring 1993 raid following Black Wednesday, apparently due to GDP revisions affecting historical measures. Lamont's budget is now scored at $43.6 billion, whilst Reeves' 2024 event sits just over $43 billion. So she holds both second and seventh place for biggest tax grabs in modern history. Quite the achievement for someone who's barely unpacked her boxes at the Treasury. At the other end of the spectrum, Nigel Lawson during the Thatcher years was scored as the biggest tax cutter, announcing £104 billion a year of reductions. Another Conservative, Anthony Barber, cut the burden by equivalent of $97.9 billion in the early 1970s, most of that coming in the single 1972 budget known as a Dash for Growth, which was followed by years of spiking inflation and desperate efforts to cut spending. That's a cautionary tale about massive tax cuts without spending discipline, but at least those chancellors were trying to leave more money in taxpayer pockets rather than extracting record sums from them. The truly alarming aspect of Reeves' record-breaking taxation is that she refuses to rule out coming back for more in future despite pushing the tax burden to new highs of proportion to GDP. Think about that. She's already taxed more than any chancellor in 60 years. The tax burden is at historic highs, and she won't rule out more tax rises ahead. What exactly would be enough for this chancellor? At what point does she say, perhaps we've taken enough from hardworking families? Apparently that point doesn't exist, or at least she's not willing to identify it publicly, which means every budget, every fiscal event, every economic update carries the threat of more tax rises regardless of how much has already been extracted. Shadow Chancellor Mel Stride's response captures a political hypocrisy perfectly. After just 18 months at the Treasury, Racheal Reeves is already making records as the biggest tax-raising chancellor in modern British history. When Conservatives said at the election that Labour would raise taxes, they said we were lying. Now they won't even rule out coming back for yet more tax rises. They are taking the tax burden to historic highs to pay for even more welfare spending. That's a core accusation that Labour simply cannot refute. During the election campaign, when Conservative warned Labour would raise taxes significantly, Labour accused them of lying, of scaremongering, of making unfounded claims. Starmer and Reeves insisted repeatedly they had no plans to raise taxes beyond specifically identified measures. And then once in office, Reeves announced the two largest tax-raising packages in recent decades within her first 18 months. Either they were lying during the campaign about their intentions, or they are so economically incompetent they genuinely didn't realize they'd need to raise taxes as dramatically. Neither explanation reflects well on their honesty or competence. But that is an incredibly indirect and uncertain route to supporting the British car industry. A more honest description would be we are raising taxes on most drivers to subsidize electric vehicle owners in the hope this speeds up the transition to zero emissions. Reeves noted that the VED changes would save more than 1 million motorists £440 a year, which sounds like a huge win until you ask the obvious follow-up question, how many motorists will be paying more, and how much more will they pay? If 1 million drivers save £440, but 2 million drivers pay an extra £500, the net effect is actually a tax increase disguised as a tax cut. The government is very good at highlighting the people who benefit while quietly glossing over the larger number of people who will be worse off. She also announced £1.5 billion in funding for the EV industry, which is taxpayer money being used to subsidize an industry that is already benefiting from preferential tax treatment. So not only are petrol and diesel drivers paying higher VED, but their tax pounds are being used to fund the electric vehicle industry that they are being punished for not buying from. Chancellor Racheal Reeves also confirmed that the government would make changes to employee car ownership schemes, which are arrangements where employees can get cars through their employer with certain tax advantages. Speaking during last year's budget, the Chancellor said these schemes will be brought into the scope of benefit-in-kind rules from April 6, 2026. This would have represented a significant tax increase for anyone using these schemes, essentially making company cars more expensive from a tax perspective. However, in a rare moment of listening to feedback, the government announced it will delay the implementation until April 6, 2030, and transitional arrangements until April 2032. That delay is welcome and suggests the government realized the original timeline was unworkable or politically toxic. But the fact that the policy is still coming, just later, means anyone using these schemes needs to start planning now for significantly higher costs in a few years. Similarly, a temporary benefit-in-kind easement for plug-in hybrids has been introduced to prevent tax charges increasing significantly as a result of new emission standards. The easement will be in place from January 1st, 2025, until April 5, 2028. This is a government recognizing that if they hit plug-in hybrid drivers with a full force of new emissions-based taxation immediately, it would cause a political backlash and might discourage people from buying hybrids as a transitional technology between petrol and full electric. So they are phasing in the pain over several years rather than delivering it all at once. But make no mistake, the pain is still coming. If you own a plug-in hybrid, your tax bill is going up significantly after April 2028. So you need to factor that into your long-term motoring costs. Drivers of HGVs, the heavy goods vehicles that keep Britain's economy moving by transporting goods across the country, will also see the VED rate operated in line with inflation, in the same move as cars, vans, and motorcycles. This might sound like a relatively minor change, but it has significant knock-on effects because haulage companies operate on tight margins. If their vehicle taxes go up, they will pass those costs on to their customers, which means the shops and businesses that rely on haulage will pay more, and they will pass those costs on to consumers through higher prices. So even if you do not own an HGV yourself, you will still end up paying for this tax increase indirectly through higher prices for goods and services. The government also stated that it would uprate the heavy goods vehicle levy in line with inflation from the start of the new financial year. This is a separate charge on HGVs based on their weight and how much they use British roads, and it is another cost that haulage companies will pass on to consumers. The cumulative effect of VED increases and levy increases means that transporting goods around Britain is becoming significantly more expensive, which feeds into general inflation and makes everything more costly for ordinary people. The broader political and economic context of these tax changes is crucial to understanding why they are happening now. Racheal Reeves is committed to not raising income tax, national insurance, or VAT in accordance with Labour's manifesto promises. But the government still needs to raise revenue to fund public services and reduce borrowing. So instead of raising the big headline taxes that everyone pays and that are politically very visible, she is going after motorists through vehicle excise duty, fuel duty, and various other charges that affect specific groups and are slightly less politically visible. It is a classic strategy of raising revenue through taxes that people do not immediately notice or that affect minorities who can be politically isolated. The problem with this strategy is that millions of people drive cars, and they absolutely will notice when their VED bills go up or when they start getting charged per mile for driving their electric vehicles. These are not obscure technical taxes that only affect wealthy individuals or corporations. These are charges that will hit working families, small business owners, and anyone who relies on a vehicle for their livelihood. The political backlash could be substantial, particularly if people feel they were misled about the true cost of the transition to electric vehicles, or they conclude that Labour promised not to raise taxes but then went after motorists because they thought they could get away with it.